Hi, Colton. I am Mr. Walter. I teach art at Walkerton Elementary, and I got your questions, and so I'm going to do my best to answer them in this short-ish video. We'll see how short I can make it. Question number one is, how many sculptures have you made? I guess it really depends on what you mean by sculptures, right? So, Colton, when we're talking about pottery and making stuff out of clay, a sculpture is something that's decorative. For example, if I come over here and I grab one of these little clay mushrooms, a sculpture is decorative, right? And so it's mostly meant to just kind of sit there on the table and it looks pretty, it's nice, but it's not really meant to do anything. Versus, you can also make other 3D things. Not everything that's 3D art is meant to be a sculpture that's looked at. Some 3D art, like this jar that I made here, is more of what you would call a vessel or a craft or a pot, if you will. And so I've made, oh gosh, I can't even count how many I've made nowadays. It's got to be at least over 100 different pots. I don't get as much time to make them as some other folks do. But there's so many different things that you can make out of clay because it's so versatile. It's like Play-Doh. You can make anything out of it. And as long as you follow certain rules here and there, you can take whatever shape you want it to take. It can be a flat little disc like this guy here. This is supposed to be a plant marker. And so it goes on this little metal doohickey that I'm not going to hang it on right now. But it's meant to mark your plants and hang and dangle there. But this one's decorated with the word love because the artist stamped those letters into it. Versus, here's another cup that I made where I made it look kind of like it was patched and screwed together, and then I sprayed certain colors onto it. We'll talk about the paints for clay later on. But if we're talking about just sculptures, I've not made many clay sculptures, but I've made a lot of stuff out of clay. A lot of cups, a lot of bowls, a lot of jars. And so at Falcon Fire, the little art studio that I run in Walkerton, we've got a lot of those on display from a couple of different artists, myself included, although I don't have that much time to make artworks of my own anymore out of clay. But I hope to get back to it when I do have time. Number two, is it easy? I guess it depends on what you mean by easy, right? With clay, since it can do so many different things, it can be easy sometimes. It can be easy to make a little pinch pot, which is just a little bowl that you make with your hands and your thumbs. But also it can be really, really difficult, especially when you're trying to make something that's a lot taller or a lot bigger, or it can be time consuming. I would say for me, making stuff that's larger is definitely not easy. It takes a lot of practice, but just like with all things, you can learn how to do it. It's just a matter of practicing and getting better at it. But starting with clay, I wouldn't say is one of the hardest things in the world. It's actually pretty easy. It's just a matter of having the tools to do it and not expecting too much of yourself before you've gotten the practice in. Number three, how much experience do you have as an artist? Again, that depends on what you mean by experience, right? I've done a lot of drawing since I was like in elementary school or since I was in middle school. And then in high school, I really started taking it seriously. My experience as an artist is more in drawing and painting, although nowadays I make a lot more pottery. As far as pottery experience that I have, I never had any clay classes in high school because we didn't have that at John Glenn. But when I got into college, I think it was my junior year of college, so my third year, I took my first pottery class where we built stuff with our hands. And we made clay coil pots and pinch pots and all sorts of clay stuff. But I took a second pottery class, which was called wheel throwing. And wheel throwing is a really popular area to explore in pottery because it's really good at really quickly making stuff that's perfectly circular. You may have seen one of these doohickeys before, or like one of these doohickeys, where this machine here spins the clay really fast, and you're able to shape it with your hands, and you learn how to shape it. This is the part that's really hard to do. You learn to shape it and make lots of different things. So I've had 2 classes in clay, in ceramics is the proper artist's word for it. And then after I graduated from college and came back and got my own house, I managed to find a kiln and a potter's wheel of my own, and I've been doing it off and on in the summers since then. I would say, honestly, as much as that sounds like kind of a lot of experience where I've had my 2 classes and I've been working on my summers and selling at art fairs and festivals, there's people who have way more clay knowledge than me. A lot of artists, especially art teachers who I talk to, are like, yeah, clay is a whole world of its own. Just like drawing and painting. There's so much to learn in clay, and so much that every artist is just, there's lots of things that you're just not going to be able to learn because clay is so broad of a field, of a thing to make stuff with, because it can make so many different kinds of things, and there's so many different places to focus on. So my experience is my 2 classes and my working in the summer times and in my spare time, but there are some people who just do it for a living and they make a whole lifetime out of pottery. There's whole books on just specific ways to fire kilns, which we'll get to. Let's see, what made me start liking art? I have an uncle who was a painter, and he went to this place called the Savannah College of Art and Design, and he owned a gallery in Colorado, and he was a painter, and that was one of the places where I was like, oh yeah, I have art in my genes, I have it in my blood, but really I was just kind of always the kid who could draw in class. I just paid attention. And so that was one place that I knew that I was strong. I knew that I had something that I could do. And so I think it was middle school and then high school later on when I really started taking it more seriously and trying to do it more actively. But it was just something that I knew I could do. I always liked to make stuff, whether it was drawings or whether it was just little crafts and flashlights in my bedroom. I think it's something since I was a little kid. I've always liked to make things in lots of different ways. Clay is just one way of making stuff. Let's see, what kind of paint do you need? That's a funny one. Because with clay, you can use paint, sure, but technically, if we're being specific about it, when you're talking about clay, you're not talking about paint. Because paint kind of sits on the surface. It sits on the top of something, and with paint, you can put like chemicals on it and it dissolves, or you can scratch it off. With clay, there's no scratching off that paint. Even if I scratch at it like that, that goes away. Because with clay, you're dealing with different chemicals. Usually what we're talking about are what's called glazes. So you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and pick up one of these guys. There's a good example. This is an example of a glazed pot by a great artist that I know. And so the brown of this pot here is what we call the clay body. And so that's actually the kind of clay that was used, because there's more than one kind of clay. There's so many different kinds of clay, which is another crazy part of it. But the inside, you can see it's shiny. It is smooth. And that shiny and smoothness is kind of here in some of these lines too. That's what we call the glaze. We call it glaze because it's not actually paint. It's a special kind of material. It's like basically powdered glass that is like soaked up in water and mixed like a syrup. And so when you put it on the clay pot, well, then you have to put the clay pot in the kiln to be fired. And glaze kind of sounds like glass, or it kind of reminds me of a glazed donut. Well, that's because glaze and glass, they both have very similar words, because glaze is literally powdered glass that you're putting on your pot. It's just kind of suspended in water so that you can paint with it. And so when we say paint for clay, what we're normally talking about is glaze. And so glaze comes in lots of different colors, lots of different styles. Some glazes are more shiny than others. Some glazes are designed in a specific way so they react with different chemicals in the air. Some glazes drip more. Some glazes are more clear. Some glazes bubble a little bit. But there's lots of different ways to use them. Some glazes are just clear. And again, with pottery, there's so many different ways to do it. There's so many different chemicals to use and clays and glazes and all that. And like this whole entire shelf is just glazes that you can buy from the store. And then this one over here, more glazes that you can just buy from the store. And that's not all the kinds of glazes you can buy from the store. So there's so many different kinds of glazes. And really, a glaze is what you want, because it's not like paint. Like I said, it's glass. So you put it in the kiln. The kiln gets really, really hot. And when it gets hot, it melts that glass. And that glass sticks to the clay, and it makes a really hard, a really smooth, protective barrier, kind of like your raincoat to keep the rain out. And that's important, because with clay, sometimes it soaks up water. And if it soaks up water, then it'll soak up milk. And if you put milk in your cup and your pot soaks it up, there's no amount of washing it that's going to get all that milk out, and it's going to get nasty. So that's why glazing, rather than painting, that's why glazing is important. Plus, if you paint the inside of a pot and then drink out of it, it's probably not going to taste very good, because paint is not as strong as glaze. Paint will wear off over time, and you don't want to be drinking chips of paint out of your pot. You really, really don't. So glazes are normally what you would use, and that's the kind of paint that you would need. Now, like I said, you got to put it in the kiln. So how does a kiln work? Well, you've probably seen a kiln in your classroom. I'll grab your questions. You've probably seen a kiln in your classroom, and it's a big oven-looking machine, but it's called a kiln, not an oven, because it gets way hotter than any oven that I've ever seen. It gets so hot, in fact, that it literally glows orange. Now, how does a kiln work? Well, there's lots of different kinds of kilns. Let's start there. There's three main ways that a kiln gets hot. Number one is the old-fashioned way, burning wood. If you've ever made a fire out in your backyard, some people make their pottery that way. They start a fire, they put their pottery in there gently, and they let it just burn. They let it get hot, and they let it get so glowing orange hot that it fires in the kiln. But actually, that's not as hot as kilns can get. Kilns can get even hotter. So that's where gas comes in. Your family might have a gas line. I'm not talking about the kind of gas that you might be making funny faces at your siblings for passing. No, a gas kiln uses natural gas and it burns at the bottom of the kiln, and it gets so hot and is so well protected, the heat stays inside of that big oven there, that these kilns can get really, really hot. Now, a gas kiln is harder to come by because you gotta have all sorts of stuff like the gas pipes. It's a little more dangerous. You gotta have ventilation. So that's where the kind of kiln that you probably have is not wood, probably not a gas one. In your classroom, you've got an electric kiln, which is like one of these guys here, where we've got this little control guy, doohickey. There's lots of different ways these can go. It's got a cord that runs all the way to the wall. But inside, you'll notice all these little, what we call the electric coils, the thermocoils. And so what those are is basically they're made of a material where if you run enough electricity through them, the material wants to stop the electricity. It's like trying to hold a rope in your hand and trying to let the rope not go through, try to stop the rope from going through. Well, what happens is it gets hot. Kind of the same idea, where these coils have so much electricity running through them when the kiln is on that they literally start to glow orange and put off lots of heat, and that's how this kiln gets hot. Now, the coils provide the electricity, but this fire brick right here, which is a special kind of brick that resists letting the heat out, it insulates the kiln. Kind of like your house might have insulation, or kind of like a refrigerator is a little bit bulkier than it needs to be. That's because it has extra stuff in there, like a blanket, to hold the heat in, because you don't want it to escape. You're making precious heat in here that gets the pots really hot. So that's how an electrical kiln works. There's a machine here, you turn on in some way, it shoots electricity through all these coils, and they get super hot and let heat go, and all your pots are down in there when the kiln's loaded. And it gets super hot until a certain temperature that it reaches, at which point, however your kilns works, it stops, it turns off, and then it eventually cools back down. What that's happening, you'll notice that the kiln turns literally glowing orange. And when it's glowing orange like that, that's when your clay is transforming. It's going from just dry dirt into that dirt gets so hot, it kind of melts together a little bit and basically becomes a rock. So by the kiln, having electricity go through all those coils and getting so hot that they become over almost 2,000 degrees or over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, your pots glow orange and they transform, they melt a little bit from rock, or from just wet, dry dirt into rock. So how kilns work both in the chemical way, from the dirt transforming, to also how the electricity works. Last but not least, what is my dream project? That's a hard one, right? Because for me, clay can go so many different directions. I think that I like lots of different things about art, and I like thinking about lots of different directions for art. I think that when I think about my dream project, I don't think about one specific thing. I think about making lots and lots of works and eventually making something that I'm really, really proud of, or with the number of work that I have made and the number of cups that I have made, making them better and better and better until I'm super proud of every single one. Because right now I still have lots of mistakes, and artists will always make mistakes, but they get better at being consistent about what they make and about making things they're proud of over time. As far as my dream project goes, this art studio, Falcon Fire Community Studio, is probably that kind of dream project where I'm able to kind of share an artist space and organize kilns and pottery wheels and all those kinds of materials for other people to share and make the work that they want to make. But if I'm thinking about like my personal dream project, that's still one I have to think about. That's a good question. Yeah, I'll get back to you on it. All right. Thank you, Colson, for reaching out. I hope this video has helped you out. I think it also will include a couple of videos that I helped produce to give you another couple of potter's perspectives from that I have known in my life. So, talk to you later.